On Father's Day, his own son tossed a crumpled $2 lottery ticket across the table and called it a gift, smirking that if it ever won, half would be his. Then, in the same breath, he unveiled a $13,000 luxury cruise package for his father-in-law, funded with money stolen from the man who raised him. The room went silent, but behind that forced smile, a storm of rage burned hotter than any candle on that Father's Day cake. What no one knew was that the joke gift would set off a reckoning no family could escape. Subscribe and stay to see what happened next. At the table that evening, the insult hung in the air like smoke after a house fire. James sat tall in his chair, shoulders squared, his smile gleaming with the confidence of a man who had just been handed the world on a silver platter. 2 embossed cruise tickets, shimmering in the soft light, lay spread out before him like treasure maps promising Mediterranean sunsets and champagne toasts on a private balcony. He touched them with deliberate pride, savoring every raised golden letter as if he were caressing the keys to some royal kingdom. Across from him, the father sat silent, the lottery ticket pressed flat under his calloused palm. $2 worth of ink and paper, tossed his way like scraps to a beggar, while the man who had married into the family was honored like a king. The silence at the table was unbearable, every clink of cutlery a dagger, every cough a reminder of the cruelty just committed. James chuckled, thanking his son with a tone soaked in entitlement, his eyes flicking toward the father with something dangerously close to mockery. Around them, the family shifted in their seats. Plates suddenly became fascinating. Glasses were lifted and drained too quickly, and not one soul dared to meet the old man's eyes. It was easier to pretend he wasn't there, easier to let the humiliation burn through him in silence. The father remembered his son at 5 years old, standing barefoot in the yard, with scraped knees and a cheap plastic baseball glove. He remembered long shifts at the factory, the grease that never washed out of his fingernails, the aching bones from hauling engines and transmissions just to put food on the table and pay for schooling. He remembered driving a rusted-out Chevy 20 miles each morning so his boy could attend the best high school in the district. Those sacrifices were not cheap tokens. They had been bought with his sweat, his blood, his years. And yet here he was, watching his own flesh and blood honor another man with luxury while reducing him to nothing more than a joke. He forced a smile, lips trembling at the edges, his throat tight. "Very thoughtful," he muttered, but the words tasted like poison. His son leaned back, smirk curling at the edge of his mouth, pleased with himself. James, meanwhile, fanned the cruise tickets in the air as though displaying winnings from a poker game. "Now this," James said, voice smooth and self-satisfied. "This is what generosity looks like." The father's stomach twisted as the word struck. Generosity. He had given his son every chance in life, and now that son dared to hold up another man as the true provider. He glanced down at the lottery ticket again. The paper was cheap, its numbers printed faintly under the glare of the dining room light. His fingers traced the edges, steady despite the fire raging inside. He wanted to slam it down, wanted to ask if anyone at that table remembered the years of sacrifice, but he didn't. He stayed silent because silence was the only weapon he had left in that moment. His silence echoed louder than a shout, though no one cared to listen. The dinner pressed on in uneasy tones. His sister tried to smile, tried to lift the mood with small talk about weather and neighborhood gossip. But her voice faltered, her eyes darting nervously between the father and the tickets on the table. Even the children grew still, their laughter swallowed by the tension that clung to the air like thick fog. The father felt each second stretch, each glance exchanged, each cough smothered. He was the ghost in his own home, invisible though his heart thundered with humiliation. When the meal ended, James left with the cruise tickets tucked neatly back into their polished box, carrying them as though he carried proof of his superiority. His son walked beside him, shoulders brushing in camaraderie, while the old man stayed behind at the table, staring at the scrap of paper he had been given. He heard the car doors slam outside, heard engines turn over, and then silence. They were gone, leaving him in a house he had built, surrounded by the echoes of betrayal. He leaned back in his chair, the lottery ticket still resting in his hand. It weighed nothing, yet it felt like a stone pressing into his palm. He thought about how his son's laugh had sounded when he tossed it across the table. Dismissive, sharp, cruel. He thought about James's smug approval, the way he had said, "Your father taught you well," as though teaching his son to mock and belittle was the lesson that mattered most. The words rang in his ears, louder than any insult. His eyes moved around the room, to the photographs lining the walls, pictures of birthdays, graduations, family barbecues. Each frame a reminder of moments when he believed love meant something, when he believed family was sacred. Now, each photo seemed tainted, stained with a betrayal too deep to wash away. He pressed his thumb harder against the ticket, feeling the paper crumple slightly. $2. That was what he was worth to his son. $2, while James was worth $13,000. He rose slowly from the table, legs heavy, and carried the ticket into the kitchen. He placed it on the counter beside his empty coffee cup, staring at it under the harsh kitchen light. His hands trembled as memories pressed in. Long nights under a hood lamp fixing cars, long mornings clocking in before sunrise, and long years of saving every penny just to give his boy the life he never had. And now that boy had stripped him of dignity in front of everyone. The house creaked around him, the settling groans of wood and plaster. It was the sound of solitude, a reminder that he was alone now. Alone with his memories, alone with his humiliation, alone with a scrap of paper that mocked him every time his eyes fell upon it. He wanted to throw it away, to erase the insult it carried. But he didn't. Something in him whispered to hold on. Something in him knew that this story wasn't finished. Outside, the sun slipped beneath the horizon, staining the sky in bruised shades of red and purple. He watched it fade from the kitchen window, his reflection staring back, weary and worn, but still standing. He had endured worse. He had survived loss, hardship, loneliness. He could survive this too. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Not after this. His phone buzzed on the counter, a message from his son flashing across the screen. He hesitated, his chest tightening as he reached for it. The words lit up. Casual, careless. "Dad, don't overreact. It's just money. We'll pay you back when we can. Maybe by Christmas." The father's chest constricted. Just money. $13,000 stolen from his account for a gift to another man, and now reduced to just money. He gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles whitened, the kitchen spinning around him. They thought his sacrifices were disposable, his years of work replaceable, his dignity expendable. He drew a slow breath, setting the phone down beside the lottery ticket. $2,013,000. Two numbers that defined the divide at his own dinner table. One represented his son's mockery. The other represented his son's theft. Together, they were proof that he had become invisible in the very family he had built with his bare hands. He straightened, shoulders squaring under the weight of truth. For years he had given, endured, forgiven. But this moment was different. This was not the kind of wound that time or apologies could mend. This was betrayal dressed as laughter, theft dressed as generosity, humiliation dressed as love. He looked down at the ticket once more, its numbers faint under the glow of the kitchen light. Something in him shifted. The paper, worthless as it seemed, held more weight than anyone at that table could have imagined. And though he didn't yet know why, he felt it deep in his bones. This slip of paper was going to change everything. The night stretched long and silent around him, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of leaves outside. He sat at the table again, the ticket laid flat before him, staring as if it might reveal some secret. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, his eyes unblinking. He was not done. Not yet. The story had only begun, and the reckoning was closer than anyone dared to imagine. He sat there in the quiet after the dinner, the laughter of his son and James still echoing faintly in the corners of his mind. The cruise tickets had been carried out like prized jewels, while the crumpled lottery slip remained behind, abandoned on the table beside his empty plate. He leaned back in his chair, staring at it, and his chest tightened with the weight of memory. Not the warm kind of memory that comforts. No, the kind that scratches against the skin like sandpaper, that reminds you of every scar carved into your hands and your back. He remembered the factory, the smell of burning oil and steel, the hiss of machinery, the way the clock always seemed broken, its hands refusing to move. He remembered rolling under broken cars with tools clutched tight in greasy hands, his body aching from bending and lifting, his skin stained with a grime that even hot water couldn't wash away. 16-hour days, back-to-back shifts, no time to breathe except for the quick gulp of burnt coffee from a paper cup. He remembered the sound of his boots on the concrete floor, each step heavy, echoing with exhaustion. Every dollar earned had a cost, and he paid it willingly because his boy needed a future. He remembered carrying his son's acceptance letter in his pocket the day it arrived. He'd opened it with trembling fingers, tears brimming in his tired eyes. All those years of sacrifice had meant something, or so he thought then. He could still see his son's face when he told him, wide-eyed, hopeful, full of dreams. The boy had hugged him hard, whispered, "Thank you, Dad," with a sincerity that felt like pure gold pressed against the heart. He remembered thinking that every hour of lost sleep, every ache in his bones, was worth that one moment. He remembered those long nights when he skipped meals so his son could eat, the times he patched his own worn-out boots with duct tape instead of buying new ones, because tuition was due and books weren't cheap. He remembered the sacrifices his wife had made too, mending clothes by hand, turning leftovers into meals that stretched farther than they should have, standing by him when the weight of life pressed down like a vice. Together, they had built a foundation, brick by backbreaking brick, for their son to stand on. And now, years later, that foundation was being mocked by the very man who had once called him hero. He remembered the graduation ceremony, the proud smile on his son's face as he walked across that stage, the diploma clutched like a sword ready to cut open the world. He had stood in the audience, clapping until his palms stung, shouting until his throat ached. That day, he believed it had all been worth it. He believed his son would carry the weight of that sacrifice with him, that he would remember the sleepless nights, the double shifts, the aching joints. He believed his son would never forget. But as he sat at the table now, staring at the cheap ticket that felt like an insult carved into his chest, he realized his son had forgotten. Forgotten, or worse, remembered, and simply didn't care. The cruise tickets given to James were proof enough. To his son, the years of grease-stained shirts and factory shifts meant nothing compared to the easy money James had spread around. Generosity, his son had called it, as though sacrifice done in silence counted for less. His mind burned with the cruel irony of it. James, who had never missed a night of sleep over an unpaid bill, was praised as generous. James, who had never skipped dinner so a child could eat, was hailed as a provider. James, who had never known the taste of exhaustion so bitter it lingered for days, was celebrated as the family's benefactor. And he, the father who had given everything, was handed a scrap of paper and laughed at like a fool. He thought about the years since his wife had passed, the way he had shouldered the role of both parents, determined not to let grief break him. He remembered the hollow nights spent sitting in his recliner, staring at the empty chair where she used to sit, and reminding himself that at least he still had his son. That was supposed to be enough. That was supposed to be what kept him moving. But now, the betrayal was so sharp it almost felt like his wife's memory was being spat on too. She had sacrificed just as much, and now her son treated it all as worthless. He looked at the lottery ticket again, its numbers blurry under the kitchen light. $2. That was what his son thought of him. That was the measure of his worth. He clenched his fist, the paper crumpling tight, his knuckles whitening with rage. He could hear his son's voice again, dismissive and smug. "If you win, half is mine." The arrogance in it, the entitlement. He wanted to shout, to pound the table, to tear the walls down around him. But instead, he sat still, the fury locked deep behind his eyes. The neighborhood was quiet outside, but inside his house the silence roared. He could hear every tick of the old clock on the wall, every groan of the floorboards beneath his feet, every breath dragging through his chest. He thought of all the men he had worked beside at the factory, men who had died young, their bodies broken from years of labor. He thought of the men who never saw their kids graduate, who never lived to see their sacrifices bear fruit. And he thought of himself, one of the lucky ones, only to sit here decades later and be told it was all worthless. He rose from his chair, the crumpled ticket still in his hand, and walked to the window. The street was bathed in pale moonlight, the houses lined up neat and quiet, their windows glowing soft and warm. He wondered if those families inside knew how lucky they were, if their children still looked at them with love instead of contempt. He wondered how many of them had stories like his, stories of sacrifice that went unseen until it was too late. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass, closing his eyes. For a moment, he let the anger settle into something colder, something sharper. He had given too much, for too long, to let this be the end of the story. His son might have forgotten, but he hadn't. Every scar, every ache, every sacrifice was etched into his bones. And now, for the first time in his life, he felt the stirrings of a different kind of resolve. The ticket still rested in his fist, fragile and worthless in appearance, but heavy with something unseen. He didn't know why, but he felt it in his gut. This scrap of paper, this cruel joke, was not done with him. Not yet. It had more to reveal, more to ignite, more to change. He opened his eyes and stared out into the night, the cold moon casting silver shadows across his kitchen floor. His story wasn't finished. In fact, it was only just beginning. And what came next would be something no one at that dinner table could have imagined. The morning light crept through the blinds, soft and unforgiving, casting pale bars across the kitchen table where the crumpled lottery ticket still lay. His coffee had gone cold in the mug beside it, untouched, forgotten. He had been staring at his laptop screen for almost an hour, his eyes sliding down rows of numbers on the bank statement. Utility bills, groceries, gas for the truck. Every line item was familiar, predictable, ordinary. Then his eyes froze on a figure that punched the air out of his lungs. $13,000. The charge read, Premium Travel Services. His hand tightened on the edge of the table, nails digging into the wood as though the surface might crack under the pressure. He blinked, shook his head, read it again. Still there. $13,000 siphoned from his account. His first thought was fraud, some criminal skimming his savings, and for a moment he even felt a strange relief. If it was fraud, it was faceless, distant, fixable. But then the date caught his eye. Last week, the same week his son had smiled across the table and handed James those cruise tickets like a crown. The realization hit him in the chest like a steel beam. His son still had access. Years ago, after his wife's death, he had added his boy's name to the account in case of emergencies, a lifeline to help manage bills if grief ever crippled him. It had seemed practical then, a father trusting the child he loved most. He had never removed it, never thought he'd need to. He had forgotten about it entirely until now. His mouth went dry. The betrayal wasn't faceless. It wore his son's features, carried his son's voice. His son had reached into his pocket without permission, without hesitation, and stolen from him. The kitchen blurred around him, his pulse pounding so loudly it drowned out the ticking clock on the wall. He saw flashes of the night before, James fanning those cruise tickets, his son grinning like he'd accomplished something noble. And he remembered the words, "Eric deserves the best, generosity, respect." As if the man who had built the family with his bare hands was nothing more than a withered husk, good only for signing checks he wasn't meant to question. He reached for his phone with shaking fingers and dialed his son's number. Each ring felt heavier, a drumbeat echoing in his skull. At last, the voice answered, casual, distracted. "Hey, Dad." That tone, flat, almost irritated, as though the call was an inconvenience. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "I'm looking at my bank statement. $13,000. Premium travel services. Did you use my account?" There was a pause, then a laugh. Not nervous, not apologetic. A laugh, light and dismissive. "Oh, that. Yeah, I booked James the cruise. He deserves it. He's done so much for us." The father's hand gripped the phone so tight his knuckles ached. His voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. You took $13,000 from me without asking?" "I didn't take anything," his son said, sharp now, defensive. "It's family money, Dad. You wouldn't have used it anyway. It was just sitting there. And James, he's been there for us, helping with the house, paying for school. This was just returning the favor. Family money." The words rang in his ears like a verdict. The years of back-breaking labor, of missed meals and sleepless nights, reduced to a communal pot his son could dip into whenever it pleased him. "That's theft," he whispered. "You stole from me." "No, it's not stealing when it's family," his son snapped back. "You did what fathers are supposed to do. James goes above and beyond. He's shown us real success, real generosity, not lottery tickets." The cruelty of it silenced him. The boy who once clung to him in fear of thunder, who once called him a hero, now dismissed his life's work as nothing more than the bare minimum. And worse, praised another man as the true provider. His hand shook as he lowered the phone, his son's voice echoing even after the line went dead. The words cut deep, deeper than any blade could. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in on him, suffocating. He stared at the lottery ticket on the table, its edges curled, its numbers meaningless in that moment. Even this worthless slip of paper had been bought with his stolen money. The insult was layered, deliberate, grotesque. His own son had reached into his pocket, humiliated him with it, and then mocked him for good measure. He pushed back from the table and stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The air in the kitchen felt thick, unbreathable. He moved to the window, pressing his palm against the cold glass. Outside, the neighborhood carried on as if the world hadn't just split open. Kids rode bikes down the street, neighbors trimmed hedges. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Ordinary life, oblivious to the earthquake inside his chest. A vibration pulled him back, his phone buzzing with a message. He picked it up, hope flickering for a split second. But the words on the screen doused it instantly. "Dad, don't overreact. It's not like you needed it. We'll pay you back when we can, maybe by Christmas." The casual cruelty of it made his stomach churn. $13,000 treated like pocket change. His sacrifice is treated like nothing more than spare coins tossed in a jar. Pay him back, maybe by Christmas, as if his dignity could be bartered with holiday promises. His fingers trembled as he set the phone down, the fury inside him sharpening into something colder, something precise. He sat back at the table, staring at the numbers on the lottery ticket as if they might shift and realign into something else, something meaningful. The paper mocked him, its weightless presence heavier than iron. Everything he had built, everything he had given, was being stripped from him piece by piece, not by strangers, but by the very person he had sacrificed for. He closed his eyes, let the silence wash over him. He had survived exhaustion, hunger, grief, the loss of his wife. But this was different. This was not a hardship to endure. This was betrayal from within, betrayal with a smile and a laugh. He opened his eyes again, his gaze steady, cold. His son thought he had won, thought he could steal, humiliate, and walk away untouched. But he was wrong. The father's breath steadied, his chest rising and falling with a new rhythm, not of despair, but of resolve. The scrap of paper on the table, the very joke meant to belittle him, suddenly felt like something more, something waiting. He didn't know what it would mean yet, didn't know what was coming. But he knew this: the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. What his son had started with theft and betrayal would end in a reckoning so sharp, so undeniable, that no one at that table would ever forget. And for the first time in days, a flicker of something unexpected stirred inside him. Not grief, not rage, something quieter, but far more dangerous. Hope. He had dialed the number with hands that shook so violently he thought the phone might slip from his grasp. The moment his son's voice came through the line, casual and unbothered, something in him clenched tight. He asked about the charge, his voice breaking as he tried to keep it steady. $13,000. Premium travel services. A cruise that had never been his to give. His son's laugh on the other end was sharp, dismissive, the kind of laugh meant to cut a man down rather than lighten a mood. "Oh, that," his son said as if they were discussing an overdue water bill. "Yeah, I booked James the cruise. He deserves it. He's always been there for us. You wouldn't have spent that money anyway." The father felt the words sink into him like shards of glass. You took it from my account without asking." His breath caught in his throat. "That's theft." "It's family money, Dad," his son snapped back, his tone colder now, layered with the arrogance of someone who believed every excuse he spoke. "James has done more for us than you ever did. You just did what fathers are supposed to do." The silence that followed roared louder than any explosion. Those words, those venomous words, cut deeper than any blade ever could. The years of broken backs and blistered hands, the decades of sacrifice, reduced to nothing more than obligation. A father's duty, a task checked off, while James, with his country club checks and polished shoes, was elevated as the true benefactor. The father's jaw tightened until it ached, his fingers gripping the phone so hard he thought it might crack. He tried to speak, to summon something that would pierce through the wall of callousness his son had built. But all that came out was a whisper. "I raised you. I gave you everything I had." His son's reply was a knife twisted deeper, and James helped us move beyond all that. He showed us what real success looks like, real generosity, not scraping by, not handing out lottery tickets. For a moment, the father could only listen to the dial tone as his son hung up. His hand dropped, the phone clattering against the table. He stared at it, his breathing ragged, his chest hollowed out. The kitchen around him seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in close, suffocating. The photographs on the wall blurred as tears filled his eyes. Not the hot tears of anger, but the heavy, bitter ones of heartbreak. He thought of his wife, gone now, and what she would have said if she'd lived to hear this cruelty. She had carried their son in her arms, rocked him to sleep, whispered love into his ear when nightmares woke him. She had patched his clothes, stayed up all night when he was sick, believed in him with the fierce tenderness only a mother could give. And now her memory was tarnished by the very child she had adored, reduced to a ledger where James's wealth outweighed their blood and sweat. The father turned toward the window, his reflection staring back at him under the pale kitchen light. His shoulders sagged, his face etched with lines deeper than age alone could carve. He remembered the nights when his son had clutched his hand at the hospital, when he cheered from the bleachers at school games, when he'd stood beaming at graduation. He remembered believing that love was enough. But tonight he saw the truth. Love had been taken, twisted, exploited, until it was nothing more than a tool for extraction. The phone buzzed again, a message blinking across the screen. His son's words lit up cold and casual. "Dad, don't make a big deal out of this. James has always supported us. This is nothing compared to what he's done. You should be grateful." Grateful. The words seared into him, mocking, cruel. Grateful that his hard-earned money had been funneled into a gift for another man. Grateful that his sacrifices were dismissed as the bare minimum. Grateful for humiliation. His lips curled into a bitter smile, though there was no humor in it. He pressed his thumb against the message, rereading it until the letters blurred. He rose from the table, walking slowly through the quiet house, his footsteps heavy on the worn floorboards. Each step echoed with the weight of betrayal. He passed the living room, where a photo of his son as a child sat framed on the mantel, bright-eyed, smiling, a boy who once clung to him as though he were the safest place in the world. He reached out, touched the glass, then pulled his hand back as though it had burned him. That boy no longer existed. In his place stood a man who saw him as nothing more than a wallet to be emptied and mocked. The father's chest tightened with fury, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He had endured exhaustion, poverty, grief. He had endured loneliness after his wife's death, endured nights where the silence screamed louder than any storm. But this was a new kind of pain. A living betrayal, one that sat at his own dinner table, wore his blood, carried his name. He walked back into the kitchen, the lottery ticket still crumpled on the table. He picked it up, smoothing it against the wood, staring at the printed numbers until his vision sharpened. Even this insult, this scrap tossed at him like trash, had been bought with stolen money. The irony of it almost made him laugh. But the sound that escaped his throat was closer to a growl. He turned the ticket over in his hand, his mind churning. The paper weighed almost nothing, yet it carried the full weight of the cruelty he had just endured. His son believed him powerless, believed that betrayal would go unanswered, believed that a father's love was a cage that kept him from fighting back. The father sat down again, his hand steady now, the fury inside cooling into something sharper. He had spent his life giving. He had given until there was nothing left, and still they demanded more. But tonight something shifted. The man who had once endured in silence, who had once believed forgiveness was endless, now felt the edge of a different resolve. He placed the lottery ticket flat on the table and stared at it in the dim light. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It wasn't just a slip of paper. It was a symbol of everything that had been stolen, everything that had been mocked. And somehow he felt it. This scrap, this insult, would become the blade that cut through their lies. He leaned back in his chair, the house groaning quietly around him, and let the silence settle deep. His son thought he had won, thought the humiliation would break him. But the father's story wasn't finished. Not yet. What began as betrayal would end in something no one at that dinner table could ever forget. And the reckoning, sharp and inevitable, was already on its way. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint smell of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of a lawnmower. He walked slowly, his shoes grinding against the sidewalk, every step heavier than the last. The houses on either side of the street looked the same as they had for decades. Trimmed hedges, flags on porches, bicycles tipped over in driveways. But tonight they felt foreign, as though he were drifting through a world that had quietly turned its back on him. Children's laughter rang out from the Henderson yard, a boy swinging at a baseball while his grandfather guided his hands with patient precision. The sound once would have warmed him. Now it hollowed him out, a reminder of what he had lost, what he would never have again. He thought of the days when his own son had stood in the yard, bare feet on the grass, eyes wide with determination as he learned to throw his first ball. He could still see the crooked smile that broke across the boy's face when he finally hit the target. The way he had run into his arms for an embrace that felt like victory for them both. Back then, he was a hero, larger than life, the center of his son's small universe. Those memories clawed at him now, ghosts that followed him down every block, whispering reminders that the love he once held so securely had been replaced with contempt. He passed Mrs. Patterson's garden, where she knelt among her tomatoes, her arthritic hands moving carefully through the vines. She looked up and waved, her face kind, unaware of the storm raging in his chest. He forced a nod, his throat too tight for words. He remembered when his son had helped her carry groceries once, back when kindness was second nature, back before greed had carved him into someone unrecognizable. Now, the boy who once lifted bags for a neighbor without complaint had grown into a man who saw his own father as nothing more than a resource to exploit. Every corner of the neighborhood was painted with memories. The corner store where he used to buy his son a candy bar after work, slipping the chocolate into small hands that clapped with joy. The park where summer afternoons stretched long and bright, his son running across the grass while he sat on a bench, exhausted from double shifts but unwilling to miss a moment. Even the cracked sidewalk beneath his feet held echoes of teaching a boy to ride a bike, steadying the handlebars, running alongside until he let go, watching with pride as the child pedaled into independence. Those same memories, once a comfort, now burned like open wounds. He reached the edge of Maple Street, where the old oak trees arched overhead, their branches swaying gently in the evening wind. He paused, looking up through the canopy, the dying light cutting across his face. How had it come to this? How had love so pure soured into something so cruel? He had thought the years of sacrifice would bind them together, that his son would carry them like a badge of honor. Instead, he was reduced to a burden, a man to be pitied, laughed at, robbed without shame. The betrayal was a weight pressing down on his chest, leaving him gasping even in the open air. His phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the stillness. He pulled it out, hope flickering weakly in his chest. But the screen only showed another message. "Dad, I talked to James. He says you're overreacting. It's not like you needed the money for anything important. We'll pay you back when we can. Maybe Christmas." The words blurred as his vision tightened. Overreacting. Not important. $13,000 stripped from him as if it were pocket change. His sacrifices boiled down to nothing but a casual text, a promise as hollow as the love behind it. He stood there for a long moment, the phone cold in his palm, before shoving it back into his pocket. His hands curled into fists as he continued walking, his legs heavy with exhaustion that had nothing to do with age. Around him, life moved forward. Neighbors called greetings, children shouted. The world spun on as though his heart hadn't been split open. He realized, with a sharp pang, that this isolation was worse than loneliness. Loneliness could be endured. Isolation born of betrayal was a different beast, a reminder that love once given could rot into contempt. By the time he reached his house again, the streetlights had flickered on, washing the block in a pale yellow glow. He climbed the steps to his porch and paused, staring at the door. This house had been his refuge, his sanctuary, the place where he and his wife had built a life brick by brick. But tonight it felt more like a cage. Inside waited silence thick enough to drown in, walls that whispered memories he could no longer bear. He unlocked the door slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing like a sigh of pity. The kitchen greeted him with the same lottery ticket on the table, lying limp and useless, a cruel symbol of the mockery he had endured. He picked it up, his fingers trembling as he smoothed the paper against the wood. The numbers stared back at him, meaningless, yet somehow alive. He thought about throwing it away, thought about ripping it into pieces just to silence its taunt. But something inside him resisted. Instead, he sat, the ticket between his hands, his mind spinning. The grief clawed at him, dragging him down into the dark. He saw his son's face as a boy, pressed against his shoulder after a nightmare. He heard the words, "Thank you, Dad," spoken years ago with genuine love. He felt the pride that had once filled him to the brim. And then, like a knife, he heard the voice from the phone again, sharp and cold. "James has done more for us than you ever did. You just did what fathers are supposed to do." The words replayed until his chest ached, until he felt hollowed out from the inside. But even in that hollow space, something began to stir. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, steadier. He had been broken before, by grief, by hardship, by loss, and every time he had risen, this time would be no different. The betrayal cut deep, but it had carved something new in its place. He set the ticket down gently, almost reverently, and leaned back in his chair. The house groaned around him, settling into its old bones, as though it too understood what had been set into motion. His grief was heavy, but grief had a way of hardening into resolve. The neighborhood outside still buzzed with ordinary life, unaware of the storm that brewed behind his quiet walls. For now, he sat in the dim kitchen light, letting the weight of memory and loss press down. But deep within, beneath the sorrow and humiliation, a fire smoldered. The betrayal would not end here. The reckoning was coming, silent but certain, and it would change everything. The call came in the middle of a quiet morning, shattering the fragile peace he had carved out for himself. He had just finished frying eggs in his old cast-iron skillet, the kitchen still filled with the scent of butter and toast, when the phone buzzed across the counter. He picked it up, expecting perhaps a neighbor, or his sister checking in. But the voice that exploded through the line was sharp, indignant, dripping with rage. "Dad, what the hell did you do to my card?" His son's tone was accusatory, almost frantic, as though he had been blindsided by the cruelty of a stranger instead of the consequence of his own theft. "They declined it at Nordstrom. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" The father froze, spatula still in his hand, the eggs cooling in the pan. His jaw tightened as he listened to the words pour out in waves. His son wasn't calling to apologize, wasn't calling to make amends. He was calling to rage, to demand, to humiliate. I removed your access, the father said slowly, each word deliberate, heavy with finality. After you stole $13,000 from my account. You've got to be kidding me, his son snapped. That wasn't stealing, it was family money. For someone who actually contributes to this family. You're selfish, Dad. Petty. Cruel. I was standing there with an $800 handbag, and the salesgirl ran my card 3 times before telling me I couldn't afford it. People were staring. Do you have any idea what that felt like? The father gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white. A handbag worth $800. He thought of the years he had driven a second-hand truck to save every penny, the countless nights he had patched his own boots instead of buying new ones, the meals skipped so his son could eat, and now this man, his son, was screaming down the line, furious that he had been denied a luxury accessory. I'm sorry you were embarrassed, the father said, voice low, steady. But that doesn't change what you did. What I did? The laugh that came back was sharp, venomous. What I did was treat James with respect, something you never learned. He deserves it. He's shown us what real generosity looks like. You sit there hoarding money like some miser, and now you're trying to make me look like a fool. The words dug deep, but they also lit something inside him. His son's arrogance, his entitlement, his blindness. It all came crashing together in a moment of brutal clarity. This wasn't just disappointment. This was contempt. This was a man who had no shame in bleeding his own father dry, then turning around and spitting in his face. You're going to regret this, his son hissed. The tone dropped then, low and dangerous, laced with a threat that made the air feel colder. You think you can humiliate me, cut me off, and just walk away? There will be consequences, Dad. You'll see. The line went dead with a click that echoed in the kitchen. The father stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, the silence after the call louder than the shouting that had come before. His eggs had gone stone cold, the skillet blackening on the stove. But he didn't move. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, his heart pounding against his ribs. For a long moment he stared at the floor, his body trembling not with fear, but with something harder. He carried the phone to the table and set it down beside the crumpled lottery ticket. The sight of them together, the device that had delivered the insult and the scrap of paper that had carried the humiliation, twisted in his gut. The ticket lay there, worthless in appearance, but suddenly it didn't feel so meaningless anymore. It was the symbol of everything his son thought of him, everything he had been reduced to. But maybe, just maybe, it was also the key to something else. He sat down heavily in his chair, elbows on the table, his hands covering his face. The fury in his son's voice still echoed in his ears. But underneath it, he heard something else. Desperation. Panic. His son's rage at being declined in public wasn't just about the embarrassment. It was about cracks forming in the life he had built on borrowed money and stolen respect. The handbag wasn't the issue. The issue was deeper. His son was unraveling, and he, the father who had given everything, had finally pulled the thread. He leaned back, lowering his hands, staring at the ceiling as the weight of it all pressed down. The threats, the accusations, the dismissal of his entire life's sacrifice, they had pushed him to a line he could not uncross. The man who had endured in silence, who had carried grief and poverty without complaint, felt the last of his patience burn away. Something inside him snapped, not with violence, but with resolve. He had been humiliated, robbed, cast aside as a burden. But no more. The son who believed he could strip his father of dignity, of resources, of pride. He would learn differently. The father's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, something sharper. For years he had carried the weight of love, as if it were a shield. But now, Love had been twisted into a weapon used against him, and he would not let it happen again. He glanced at the lottery ticket once more, its faint numbers staring back in the dim light. He thought about tearing it apart, thought about burning it, but stopped. Instead, he smoothed it flat against the table. There was something about it that held him. A joke gift, bought with stolen money, dismissed with laughter. But there was a strange gravity to it now, as though fate had pressed it into his hands for a reason. He pushed himself up from the chair, the phone and the ticket still resting side by side on the wood. His house was quiet, but inside his chest, a storm brewed. His son thought the game was over, thought his father had been beaten into submission. But the father knew different. He had reached his breaking point, and once a man reached that edge, there was no return. He walked to the window, the night pressing against the glass, and let the silence settle around him. His son had threatened consequences, but he understood something his son never would. Consequences cut both ways, and the reckoning that waited just beyond the horizon would be one his son could never escape. The first sign came not from his son directly, but from a neighbor's sidelong glance. He was out front pulling weeds from the flower beds, the sun low and hot on the back of his neck, when Mrs. Klein walked past with her little terrier. Normally she stopped to chat, her voice warm with routine pleasantries. But that morning she only offered a quick nod, her eyes darting from his face to the sidewalk as though she couldn't quite look at him. He felt the shift immediately, the sudden space between them, like a pane of glass had been set down mid-conversation. He stood there, hands in the dirt, and knew something was wrong. The confirmation came later, when a coworker from the old factory called, hesitant, his voice carrying a strange mix of pity and curiosity. "You seen what's online?" he asked. The father frowned, confusion prickling. "No, why?" The coworker coughed. "Better take a look, before more people call." The line went dead, leaving him standing in his kitchen with the phone pressed to his ear. The same kitchen where the lottery ticket still lay on the table, like a mocking shadow. He opened his laptop, the screen flaring to life, and there it was, his son's words, splashed across social media for the world to see. Paragraph after paragraph, each one twisting the truth into something grotesque. His son had written about betrayal, about how his own father had stolen a winning lottery ticket meant for him, about how loyalty meant nothing to a man consumed by greed. The comments stacked like bricks, a wall of judgment building higher with every refresh. Some were strangers, anonymous voices quick to condemn. Others were faces he recognized, neighbors, old coworkers, even distant relatives, people who knew his name and now whispered it like a curse. He scrolled further, his stomach tightening. There was a photo, one he hadn't known his son had taken. It was from Father's Day dinner, the lottery ticket lying limp on the table, his hand resting beside it. Out of context, it told a different story, one his son's words eagerly exploited. The caption beneath it screamed, "Proof." Look how he clutched it like it was always his. He stared at the image, his own weary face reflected in the glossy surface of the table, and for the first time, he felt the cold weight of public shame. The phone buzzed with messages. Some were curious. Is it true? While others were cruel, accusing him of betrayal, of greed, of turning his back on his own family. He set the phone down, unable to read further, but the whispers lingered. At the grocery store, he felt eyes follow him down the aisles. At the gas station, conversation hushed when he walked past. A man he'd known for 20 years crossed the street rather than meet his gaze. He had become the villain in his own neighborhood, the cautionary tale spun out of lies. At night, the silence of his house grew heavier. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word his son had posted, every comment that cut like glass. The betrayal was no longer private. It had been dragged into the light, paraded for strangers to dissect. He thought of his wife, long gone, and how she would have shielded him from this, her presence a barrier against cruelty. Without her, the loneliness pressed harder, suffocating. He had never felt more abandoned. The bitterness ate at him in the quiet hours. He thought about the years he had carried his son on his shoulders, paraded him proudly through the town fair, waved to neighbors who now whispered behind their curtains. He thought of the late nights spent helping with homework, teaching him how to balance numbers, guiding him through essays and science projects, and now those same neighbors, those same acquaintances, looked at him with suspicion, as though the truth didn't matter, as though the narrative painted online was more powerful than decades of sacrifice. Yet, beneath the shame, something else stirred. It was faint at first, like an ember buried under ash, but it grew with every cruel glance, every dismissive whisper. His son had stripped him of dignity, and now he was trying to strip him of reputation too. But shame, he realized, could be survived. Lies could be endured. What could not be erased were the facts, the truth lying in plain sight, the reality of who had truly betrayed whom. He sat at the kitchen table one evening, the lottery ticket before him, the glow of his laptop casting a cold light across the room. He read the lies again, then closed the screen. He no longer needed to scroll through the venom. He no longer cared about the strangers who judged. What mattered was the truth, and truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it was buried. The humiliation had been sharp, the shame unbearable, but in its shadow, a new resolve had formed. He had been dragged through the mud, painted as a thief, mocked as a man without loyalty. And yet, as he stared at the numbers on the ticket, faint under the kitchen light, he felt a strange calm. His son thought the lies had won. His son thought reputation once destroyed could never be rebuilt. But he was wrong, because beneath the silence of that house, beneath the grief and the whispers, something was building. The truth was waiting, and when it finally surfaced, when the lies collapsed under their own weight, the reckoning would not just be personal. It would be public, undeniable, and far more devastating than any shame he had endured. It happened on a Tuesday night, the kind of evening where the world outside seemed ordinary, almost dull. He had been sitting at the kitchen table, the lottery ticket resting where it always did, half buried under yesterday's newspaper and a stack of unopened mail. The television murmured in the background, one of those local broadcasts he rarely paid attention to, the kind filled with chatter about traffic on the interstate or the rising price of milk. He almost turned it off when the lottery numbers came on. But something, a flicker of instinct, a whisper buried in his chest, kept him still. The announcer read the numbers slowly, with the kind of drama meant to string along tired viewers. One by one, the digits matched. His heart stuttered. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the ticket in his hand, his fingers trembling as though the paper carried voltage. The announcer continued, and the impossible became undeniable. All 6 numbers, a perfect match, $120 million. The room spun. For a long, suspended moment, there was nothing but silence. The silence of disbelief, the silence of a life pivoting on the head of a pin. The ticket, once mocked as trash, once tossed to him with laughter and contempt, had transformed. It was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It was salvation. It was power. His breath came fast, uneven. He pressed the ticket flat against the table, staring at the ink, the numbers that glowed in his mind like embers. He thought of his son's sneer, the way he had laughed, the way James had been exalted while he was handed this scrap of paper. Garbage, they had called it. A joke. And now this garbage was worth more than every dollar James had ever flaunted. more than every insult his son had ever hurled. He rose from the table, pacing the room, the ticket clutched in his hand, as though it might vanish if he let it go. His mind spun through decades, every insult, every sacrifice, every night spent breaking his back in the factory. He saw them all now through a different lens. The years of being overlooked, dismissed, reduced to obligation. They had all led here, to this moment, to this absurd twist of fate. He imagined his son's face when he found out, the fury, the disbelief, the desperate clawing for a piece of what he had so casually thrown away. He could already hear the arguments forming. It was mine. I gave it to you. We should share. The lies and entitlement would come fast, dressed as loyalty, wrapped in the language of family. But this time, the father would not bend. This time he held the weapon. He sat back down, the ticket resting once more on the table, and let the weight of it settle over him. The number was too big to comprehend. 120 million. More money than he had ever dreamed of. More money than his son could ever squander on handbags and cruises. It wasn't just wealth. It was freedom. It was the final word in a conversation his son had thought he controlled. But beneath the rush of adrenaline, there was something else, something colder. This wasn't just a win. This was a reckoning. Fate had placed a weapon in his hands, and he would not waste it. Every slight, every humiliation, every whisper that had dragged his name through the mud, it all had an answer now. And that answer was printed in faint ink on a slip of paper worth more than his son's entire world. He thought of the neighbors, the whispers, the pitying looks. He thought of Mrs. Klein crossing the street, of strangers online condemning him for theft. How quickly they had judged, how easily they had believed the lie. Soon, their tune would change. They would see the truth. But he didn't want their apologies. He didn't need their approval. He wanted something deeper, something sharper. He wanted them all, his son, James, the entire circle that had mocked and dismissed him, to choke on their arrogance. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands finally steady, and sipped it slowly. The house around him, once suffocating in its silence, felt different now. The air seemed lighter, the walls less oppressive. For the first time in weeks he felt control return, seeping into his veins, straightening his spine. He was no longer the man begging for scraps of respect at his own table. He was no longer the father humiliated by his son's cruelty. He was something else now, something untouchable. The ticket lay between his fingers, fragile yet invincible. He thought about what came next. He would claim it quietly, carefully, without spectacle. He would move in silence, the way he always had. But this time every step would be his own. His son would beg, would scream, would threaten. James would sneer. Neighbors would gossip. The world would clamor for a piece. But he would decide who to cut in and who to cut out. And when the hammer fell, it would fall with precision. He looked around the kitchen one last time, the room where humiliation had burned deepest, the place where his son's cruelty had left him feeling worthless, where neighbors' whispers had followed him like shadows. He could almost hear the echoes of those words, selfish, cruel, a thief. He smiled then, a slow, dangerous curve of the lips. They had no idea what was coming. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a heartbeat in the quiet room. He set the ticket down carefully, smoothed it flat, and pressed his palm against it. In that moment, he felt something shift, something irreversible. The balance of power had changed, and it was never going back. His son thought the story was his to control. James thought respect was his to command. The neighbors thought judgment was theirs to hand down. But now the father had the final word. The lottery ticket was not just money. It was justice. It was the blade he would wield. And as he sat there, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, he realized the most ironic truth of all. The weapon they had given him was born from their own contempt. They had mocked him with this gift, laughed at him, dismissed him, and that mockery had become the very thing that would destroy them. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, already imagining the moment when the truth would surface, when his son would realize the scale of his mistake. That moment would come soon enough, and when it did, no amount of pleading, no cries of family loyalty would save him. Because this time, the father was not the one stripped of power. This time, the reckoning belonged to him, and it would be ruthless. He didn't come quietly. His son stormed up the porch steps like he owned the place, shoulders squared, voice already raised before the door swung open. The arrogance dripped off him, the same arrogance that had been fed by years of entitlement, now sharpened by desperation. His eyes went straight to the father's hands, as if the ticket itself would still be there, waiting to be snatched. "Half," he barked. "You know it's mine. You wouldn't even have had it if I hadn't given it to you. That win belongs to both of us." The father stood still, his expression carved from stone. The fury that had once burned in him was gone, replaced by something colder, sharper, more dangerous. He let the silence stretch, the weight of it forcing his son to shift uneasily, though he tried to mask it with bluster. At last, the father spoke, his voice steady, low, and final. "That ticket was a gift, a joke. You called it garbage when you tossed it at me. And the money you used to buy it? Stolen from my account. That win belongs to me, not you." His son's face twisted, the sneer collapsing into something closer to panic. "You can't do this," he snapped, his voice cracking under the strain. "We're family. Family shares. Family doesn't turn on each other." The father stepped closer, his eyes unblinking, his words slicing through the air. "Family doesn't steal. Family doesn't humiliate. Family doesn't drag my name through the mud for strangers to gawk at. You wanted James. You wanted his money, his praise, his approval. Well, go to him. Let him share with you. But not me. Not anymore." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to choke on. His son stood there, chest heaving, eyes darting around the room, as though searching for some crack in his father's resolve. But there was none. The man who had once bent, who had once forgiven, who had once endured in silence, no longer existed. In his place stood someone remade, forged by betrayal and hardened by truth. His son tried again, softer this time, desperate. "Dad, think about what you're doing. Think about how this looks. People already know. They'll believe I was cheated. They'll take my side." The father shook his head slowly, almost pitying. "Let them believe whatever they want. I know the truth, and so do you." He turned his back then, the conversation over, his footsteps echoing on the old wood floor. His son shouted after him, voice rising with anger and fear, but the words bounced off walls that no longer cared to listen. The door closed with finality, shutting out the storm. What followed was not chaos, but clarity. He claimed the winnings in silence, avoiding spectacle, refusing interviews, letting the world buzz while he moved with precision. $120 million. A number that would have once seemed absurd, now a tool sharper than any blade. He didn't squander it, didn't let greed twist it into something ugly. He rebuilt himself with it, piece by piece. He bought a small building on Main Street, the kind of place most people drove past without noticing. Inside, he opened a restoration shop. Old furniture, forgotten heirlooms, the things people thought were broken beyond repair. He spent his days sanding, staining, rebuilding, giving new life to what had been discarded. Each stroke of the brush, each nail driven into wood, felt like a reclamation of himself. People came, quietly at first, then steadily, drawn not by the money, but by the work, by the dignity in his craft. With part of his fortune, he started a foundation in his wife's name, one dedicated to helping widows and single parents who knew the weight of sacrifice. Scholarships, housing assistance, community support, real things for real people who had been overlooked. The foundation became his pride, a living answer to the years of toil and the years of betrayal. He no longer gave blindly to those who demanded. He gave purposefully to those who understood the value of every dollar, every chance. Neighbors who once whispered began to watch differently. They saw the shop, the foundation, the quiet strength of a man who had been dragged through shame and come out standing taller. Some tried to apologize, to mend fences. He accepted their words with grace, but never forgot the silence when he had needed truth most. Trust, once broken, was not so easily restored. His son came back once more, months later, standing on the porch with eyes hollowed by desperation. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the weight of his own choices. He begged this time, pleaded, the words tumbling out in a rush of regret and fear. But the father only listened quietly, his face unreadable. When the pleas ran dry, when the silence settled heavy again, he spoke the truth plainly. I gave you everything once. You threw it away. There's nothing left to give. The door closed for the last time. The father felt no guilt, no doubt, only peace. He had cut the ties that bled him dry. He had chosen dignity over humiliation, purpose over bitterness, freedom over toxic bonds. In the evenings, he sat in the shop's back room, the scent of cedar and varnish thick in the air, the quiet hum of life steady around him. The lottery ticket, now framed, hung on the wall above his workbench, not as a reminder of wealth, but as a reminder of survival. What had once been tossed at him as garbage had become the symbol of his salvation. He ran his hands across the smooth surface of a newly restored table, the wood glowing under the light. This was his life now, restoration, not just of furniture, but of himself. The past was a scar, permanent, but no longer raw, and the future was his alone to shape, unburdened by those who had tried to chain him to their greed. Outside, the town carried on. Children rode bikes, neighbors tended gardens, shopkeepers swept their stoops. He walked those same streets again, but this time the whispers had stopped. People nodded, some with respect, some with quiet awe. He returned the nods, not with pride, but with a calm acknowledgement. He didn't need their approval. He had his own. The reckoning had come and gone, sharp and final. And in its wake, he found what he had been denied for far too long: freedom. True freedom, and it was worth more than every dollar in the world. Life has a way of teaching us that love without respect is no love at all. In this story, a father gave everything, his years, his labor, his sacrifices, only to be dismissed, used, and humiliated by the very person he raised. The turning point came not with anger, but with resolve. He chose to walk away from toxic family ties and reclaim his dignity, building a life centered on purpose rather than pain. The lesson is clear. No matter how deeply we love, we must also protect our self-respect. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are survival. Money may reveal greed, but character reveals truth. And when life hands us an unexpected chance at renewal, we can either waste it on bitterness or use it to restore ourselves and others. For older viewers, this story is a reminder that it's never too late to stand tall, to choose peace, and to invest in the people and passions that truly matter. Dignity once reclaimed is more valuable than any fortune. If this story touched you, subscribe now. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments. What does dignity mean to you?